Hello, everybody. My name is Henry Kuba. I'm an environmental studies and philosophy major here at PLU. The name of my capstone project is Sleeping with the Fishies, the Interconnected Demise of the Great Barrier Reef and Human Ways of Life. Some background videos, such as the one in my introduction slide, are for aesthetic purposes, and others, such as this one, will be used as visual aids. To begin, I'd like to go over some important terms and acronyms you'll be encountering throughout my presentation from my two disciplines, biology and philosophy. The primary biological phenomenon my project addresses is that of coral bleaching. When sea surface temperatures become too warm, the coral skeleton will expel the small animals which perform photosynthesis and sustain the coral, called polyps. It's understood that these high temperatures and sun exposure force the polyp cells to overproduce toxic oxygen molecules which damage proteins. Much like how we throw out food that our body identifies as toxic, the coral does similarly with its polyps. This background video is of the Great Barrier Reef after one of its largest bleaching events in 2017. In normal circumstances, all of this white coral would be brightly colored. Other stationary organisms such as anemones are also casualties of bleaching events as they're unable to relocate to more ideal water conditions. Bleaching events are usually influenced by multiple factors. Reefs exposed to runoff pollutants introduced by water entering the reef from catchment areas are at higher risk of bleaching. For example, fertilizer pollutants from agriculture around catchment areas makes for the perfect food source for crown of thorn starfish larvae, creating massive outbreaks. These starfish suck polyps off of coral structures and can in themselves cause mass bleaching. When considering the reasons we should care about certain happenings in nature, there are three primary schools of thought. First, anthropocentrism asserts that an action towards nature is only wrong if it negatively impacts people. Only humans should be granted intrinsic value, meaning humans are an end in themselves and should not be viewed as a means to achieve any given goal. However, animals have instrumental value and should be viewed as a means to achieving human goals. On the other hand, biocentrism states that non-human living things should be given intrinsic value and seen as ends in themselves rather than a means to an end. We should therefore try not to harm or interfere with living things to the same extent as we would with one another. Finally, ecocentrism assigns this notion of intrinsic value to ecosystem functionality as a whole rather than to individual organisms. Utilitarianism is integrated in some environmental philosophers' frameworks. As many of you know, utilitarianism is morally concerned with the total amount of good or bad the consequences of any given action produce. The guiding question for my research was, which ethical framework provides the most effective model to mitigate coral bleaching and restore damaged reefs? Being the most extensively researched and largest, I chose the Great Barrier Reef as the primary focus for my project. I concluded that an anthropocentric perspective is the most effective framework to mitigate coral bleaching in the Great Barrier Reef. This topic is important and relevant because we are currently facing a global extinction of our reef ecosystems. This background video depicts a reef that has failed to recover and has begun to decompose, leaving a vast field of algae in its wake. Bleaching is becoming more devastating and more frequent as global warming worsens. In the past 5 years alone, there have been 3 major bleaching events on the Great Barrier Reef. In ideal conditions without additional stressors, reefs can recover from bleaching events within a decade, but we are unlikely to experience another 10-year period without a bleaching event. The Great Barrier Reef lost half of its coral coverage recorded in 1995 by 2017. It's estimated that 25% of all reefs are no longer functional, meaning they no longer support a majority of species that had once lived there. And it's estimated that by 2070, on our current path, all coral reefs will be non-functional. The crucial instrumental value the Great Barrier Reef has to humans is apparent in many ways. The value of coral reefs originate from their ability to support significant biodiversity. Various stationary organisms act as habitat structures for the many different vertebrates on the reef. The background video depicts this relationship with sea anemone and clownfish. The disappearance of coral results in the disappearance of organisms that drive the fishing and tourism industry. As an economic asset, the Great Barrier Reef has been appraised at $51.4 to $56 billion in raw resources and services. It contributes $6.4 billion to the Australian economy annually, $3.4 billion of which comes directly from tourism. It goes without saying that without these aesthetic attractions, the tourism industry would collapse. More notably, coral reefs play an integral role in medical science. Almost half of the medicines in use are derived from organisms. With the large majority of reef organisms yet to be discovered, there's immense future value within the Great Barrier Reef. Stationary organisms must develop chemical compounds to hunt and defend themselves, making for a bounty of different substances with different benefits. For reference, one is 300 to 400 times more likely to discover a medically relevant compound in a coral reef than one is on land. Reef species have provided us with compounds that can treat a multitude of common, crippling, and life-threatening diseases. In order to save reefs from bleaching, many different tactics have been devised. Coral farms and nurseries are one of the most prevalent forms of restoration. Nurseries grow coral outside of the ocean and expose it to different water conditions to build adaptability. Farming involves propagating and then later replanting coral individuals shown to have more resilient traits by surviving bleaching events. The background video shows some divers participating in the coral farming process. The Great Barrier Reef has been under the protection of the government as a marine park since 1975 and a World Heritage Site since 1981, sheltering it from many of the domestic threats other reefs face. In a response to the degradation caused by bleaching, the Australian government has produced a plan to secure its future by 2050. While the plan updates on an annual basis, the focus has primarily been on managing fishing and catchment areas. Tactics which directly interfere with the environment, like COTS culling and coral nursing, are a smaller focus and very small operations. It costs about $1 billion to replant 10 square kilometers of bleached coral, and only $16 million is being put towards coral nurseries. While the Australian government focuses primarily on domestic issues affecting the reef, as the 16th largest greenhouse gas emitter and the largest coal exporter in the world, it still has yet to make significant leaps towards the root cause of coral bleaching. Despite the desperate condition of the Great Barrier Reef, non-interference methods like the protections implemented in the 70s and 80s are still the preferred route. In all, only $2 billion is allocated for a 10-year period where they're estimated to generate nearly $65 billion. While there's financial and moral hesitancy to exploring additional rehabilitation options, the continued rapid decline of the ecosystem's health calls for a more involved approach. I believe that an anthropocentric view allows us to best implement these solutions and maintain the biological diversity of the Great Barrier Reef. Anthropocentrism is associated with traditional Christian ideas of dominating and subduing the near infinite resources of nature. Instead, I argue that our own self-interests lie in our ability to maintain the functionality and diversity of ecosystems. What is good for the natural world is good for us. Extending equal consideration and intrinsic values to nature is unnecessary to sustain healthy environments and may impede our ability to properly conserve. Biocentric and ecocentric perspectives face a number of practical challenges. As previously mentioned, high biodiversity, meaning a large number of various organisms within a given ecosystem, supply the services provided by the Great Barrier Reef. Biocentrists argue that non-human living animals should be seen as an end within themselves and have their own goals. However, it's unclear what these goals are. For example, there have been 5 natural mass extinctions, eliminating swaths of biodiversity. Many native species today were at one time a troublesome invasive species that transferred perhaps from seeds and bird droppings, threatened biodiversity, and are now members of a balanced ecosystem. Biodiversity can occur in nature, but it's not necessarily its goal or end. If we accept we should not interfere with animals as we should not with each other, as animal rights advocates propose, who would enforce these rights, and how would we gauge our rights versus those of animals? should our rights and interests somehow have a higher moral standing, non-rational animals are left out of such discussions. Granting these rights could allow COTS to destroy the Great Barrier Reef in our lifetime based on the notion that they have a right to follow their goals and not be interfered with. While there's evidence that human activity is encouraging COTS outbreaks, humans have always and will always influence the environment non-directly to some extent. There's no ecosystem that has not been touched by people, but allowing strict animal rights prevents us from interfering directly to maintain biodiversity. Peter Singer proposes that because animals are capable of feeling pain, they should be added to the utilitarian calculus of total good and count as one, just like an individual human. However, there are problems with producing such calculations. It's impossible to objectify different pain experiences. You can observe whether or not a dog, for example, is in pain based on yelps and winces, but stationary animals found in the reef are much like plants in the sense that there's little to no observable pain response. We simply can't equate feelings of pain from species to species. Ecocentrism, while allowing for actions biocentrists would denounce, faces the same problem of being unable to identify the specific interests of nature. Although Leopold, the granddaddy of ecocentrism, states in his land ethic that a thing is right when it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of a biotic community, it is wrong when it tends otherwise. Because nature cannot be said to have any identifiable interests or goals, he's basing his value system off of the states of nature that are appealing aesthetically and resourcefully, ultimately assigning instrumental value to nature. Anthropocentrism receives a fair share of criticism as well. If Western anthropocentric views of dominion encouraged the exploitation of environmental resources in the past, why would adopting an anthropocentric perspective be different now? Our way of life and the future of our species are at the mercy of nature to an extent that hasn't been seen in a very long time. I believe under the context of climate change, it's become widely apparent that it's in the interest of the human race to create a more sustainable future and preserve these ecosystems for continued use. If we center the value of nature on its use to humans, only economically viable species will be protected. I argue that if enough economically non-viable species become extinct, it will have devastating impacts on the environment any economically viable species depend on. This New Age anthropocentrism requires a broad view of what we find valuable in nature. Even if economically viable species can be farmed and their native environments are no longer required for propagation, like in the case of the Great Barrier Reef, there are many undiscovered species that could prove to have great value and motivate conservation of these natural habitats. And finally, the arbitrary differences used by men to suppress women are similar to those people use to justify superiority over animals. My simple answer for this is that animals are unable to ask what ought we to do and plan careful solutions, and therefore cannot be integrated into a society of mutual interactions and relationships complete with rights. So to conclude, an anthropocentric framework which places instrumental value on the Great Barrier Reef's biodiversity allows for and motivates the integration of necessary preventative and restorative methods to prolong the biodiversity present in the Great Barrier Reef. This framework on a small scale has provided monetary benefits for coffee and cocoa farmers maintaining a biodiverse landscape. Rather than using their entire plot of land for their crop, they allocate sections for native growth, which creates shade and attracts birds that eat pests, allowing their plants to have higher yields. While not entirely applicable to the Great Barrier Reef, it helps further demonstrate the instrumental value of biodiversity. As far as my limitations go, there are many other frameworks I could have analyzed. I chose not to consider obligations towards future generations because we could definitely see the extinction of reef ecosystems within our lifetime. It would have been interesting to explore the obligations different nations have towards controlling indirect pollutants and protecting one another's World Heritage sites, but for this scope, a domestic focus better suited my biology discipline. And as I briefly mentioned earlier, the 2050 plan gets updated annually and considers public feedback through surveys. The new version is released in the fall and could very well include tactics I advocated for here today. And that's all I got. Thanks for watching, and thank you to my cohort, my professors, my mentors, my mom and dad. If you have any questions, feel free to chime in.